the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is to the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machine to Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always, sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, I just want to mention that we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider dropping us $1 a month there, or if not, it'd be great if you could leave us a nice review on iTunes. Today, Taylor and I are honored to bring you Michael Hardt. Perhaps needs no introduction for our listeners. He's currently professor of literature and romance studies at Duke University, co-author with Toni Negri of The Labor of Dionysus, a critique of the state form, Empire, Multitude, War and Democracy in the Age of Empire, Commonwealth, Declaration and Assembly, among others. Taylor and I are just thrilled to have you today. It's a big honor for us. Obviously, I think our listeners are going to be thrilled to be able to listen to this conversation. So just, thank you from our little machinic hearts. Machinic welcome to you.
Yeah, we'll have some fanboys and fangirls out there. They were pretty excited when we first announced when you agreed to come on. So I really appreciate that. And as a side note, I wasn't able to necessarily find your sort of full working title at Duke. Hopefully I was in the ballpark there.
Oh yeah, I don't actually know if it's any different than that, but that sounds good.
All right, as long as some people care more about that thing, and it seems like that's not a big deal. As I mentioned to you before the show started, we do like to hear sort of about any personal, maybe a memory or an anecdote, or just your understanding of how you sort of got into, whether it be the humanities, philosophy, literature, just a little bit of your origin story, as we like to call it.
Maybe the most relevant part is that I got into the kind of theory that that you guys are interested in, that I'm interested in, really through political interests and a certain amount of political activism. But so I came to the academic things kind of secondarily.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. And this is actually, my interest in meeting Toni Negri when I first did was that I was frustrated at the time. So I was 25-ish, I guess. I'd graduated. I was working as an engineer. I was an engineer as an undergraduate. And I was frustrated that my political and activist interests didn't coincide with my scholarly interests. And even among the activist crowd, at least that I was involved in, there was what I perceived then as a kind of anti-intellectualism, like we already know all the answers.
Right.
Like there's good and bad, so part of those things were frustrating. It was part of then the interest in meeting Toni Negri was that, well, two things. One is that I felt like the kind of politics that had taken place in Italy in the 70s, what I knew of it at the time, seemed closer to something that I could relate to in the US. I mean, that because I had more experience with Central American politics at the time, and it didn't seem to me to transfer very well to the US. So that was one thing. But the other thing was that reading Toni's work, what I'd read at the time, then it seemed like he didn't have a sort of gap between what he thought of as his scholarly work and his, political activist work. It felt reading it like they were sort of one and the same. And that really attracted me. Through that vehicle, I got more interested in the theoretical things. In fact, I read Deleuze first because I read a small book that Toni did with Félix Guattari, and then I thought, oh, that's cool. Then I read Anti-Oedipus because I thought, this Guattari guy sounded kind of neat. And then, via that to Deleuze. So it was a bit of that trajectory. But that was, whatever, in the 80s. So ancient history, 30 years ago now.
Is that Communists Like Us? Is that
yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And I know that the first book that you co-authored with Negri, and I know some of it's articles that were repurposed for the volume.
Yeah.
The Labor of Dionysus, Critique of the State Form. Both of you, I assume, dedicated the volume to Guattari, who would have just passed away, in the previous year, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. Toni and he were quite close for quite a long time. And through Toni, I was, had the privilege to meet him and, I don't know, go out to movies a few times, go to his house, that sort of thing.
That's great. I mean, I'm sure people would love to just hear an episode about that. But,
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing, you were talking about, what's so interesting is, Negri's philosophical work and his scholarly work and his activist work kind of dovetailing together. I mean, some of that reminds me a little bit of perhaps Guattari's interest in alternative versions of psychoanalysis. But the book, I assume that the sort of reason for meeting Negri was your translation of The Savage Anomaly. And do you have maybe any memories that you want to share, anything interesting about that, or how you took that up, or how, was that a project you did on your own?
Yeah, it was sort of the opposite cause and effect, though, than what you said, which was that I translated the book in order to meet him rather than.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
And so I figured, Toni at the time was clandestine in France, and I knew, I knew some of the situation. It seemed complicated. I had a friend who, actually was a friend of a friend at the time. Mm-hmm. Brian Masumi was in Paris, and and the friend I knew told me that Brian knew Toni and stuff like that. And so via him, I got in touch and I said, I had translation questions and maybe we could talk about it. And so he called me, Toni called me and said, well, why don't you come to Paris for a week and we'll talk about the translation stuff. And so I did. That was great. And then during the week there, he said, this is great. Why don't you move to Paris and we'll talk about philosophy stuff.
It's interesting because for a moment there to touch base with you on translation, the first translation of the book project, at least I did, was sadly, Guattari had already passed away, The Machine Unconscious. And then I did several volumes of Laura Wells' work, who I haven't gotten to visit him in person, but I have. It was nice to be able to start up a correspondence, and meet someone who was still breathing and able to talk through these things. I know there's no way of comparing translating a work of someone living who can respond and interact with you versus not, where you have to fill in a lot of those gaps. And the last volume, Simon Don, he's passed in the 80s, right? So that's something that I'm a little bit envious of, right? Is striking up such a, not just, I assume, a friendship, but this long lasting and prolific collaborative work you've gotten to do with Toni.
It's a great gift.
Okay. So let's see, Savage Anomaly comes out in, 86? I forgot so sometime in the 80s. Maybe
a little bit later, because later. I didn't finish it until about 89 or 90, because so I went to Paris and then I just came back to the US to defend. I'd done my exams and I went to Paris.
Right.
And then I came back and defended in 1990, and that's about when I'd finished the translation. So I bet Savage Anomaly probably came out in the early 90s and
gotcha.
And the other books too, yeah.
And then the Labor of Dionysus that comes out in 93, and so that already, your working relationship with him spans 30 years. And, I guess what's interesting too is, as you mentioned, I assume your dissertation defense, was this the Apprenticeship of Philosophy, your book on Deleuze? Is that what that became?
Yeah, that was the first half of the dissertation.
Okay.
And just went pretty directly to book form, which was great.
I guess I'm curious, what was the second half, if you don't mind?
It was about Italian stuff, they were very separate halves. And okay. I guess it was a pretty long dissertation now that I think about it in retrospect. I had kind of a relationship with an editor at the University Press. And so which was great, as a privilege, he wanted to look at it when I'd finished the dissertation and then suggested that I divide it in half. And then I never really wanted to do anything with the second half. So gotcha. I just let that go. Yeah.
I guess two things. One, off the top of my head, your book on Deleuze was one of the first. I know Ronald Bogue maybe holds that in English on Deleuze, and
there weren't many in French either at the time.
Interesting, right?
Yeah, but yeah, I'm sure that the Ronald Bogue book came out first before that. You're right. I mean, it seems strange now, so many years later, that at least my perception at the time, we're going to talk like 85-ish. There was a lot of interest in the U.S. universities, especially in literature departments in Derrida. A lot of interest in Foucault too, and both of them were very present in the U.S. and had done lectures and things. And really, Deleuze there was very little focused on Deleuze. Whereas in France at the time, he was he was a huge figure, and Derrida, in fact, wasn't.
That's interesting.
A particularly large figure at the time in France. But so, now, of course, in English and in all these other languages, there's so much work on Deleuze, I can't keep up with it.
Of course.
But at the time, it hadn't functioned that way. And I don't know if that's because, Deleuze himself was not one who traveled and spent time with the U.S. universities the way Foucault and Derrida did. But I don't know if it's that or just that maybe the work didn't correspond to what people were focused on at the time. I don't really know exactly the reason for it, but it felt like there were few of us. And I mentioned Brian Masumi before, who of course was certainly the leading, seemed to me the leading person working in these areas. It didn't feel like there were many others, and maybe I just didn't know them, but there wasn't a lot.
A part of it is the chronology of the translations, not just Deleuze perhaps being insular and not really wanting to go anywhere. But what anti-oedipus comes out in 1978, but it's really not until the 1990s that we get Logic of Sense and Difference of Repetition. And before that, there was here and there some of his monographs like Nietzsche and Philosophy. It is a kind of out of sync temporality, I think, and that partly accounts for that. But on the other hand, as you said today, I think of it almost like as an industry. I've called it Deleuze Inc. before. It's hard to keep up with so much, which, I guess is, on the one hand, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But, on the other hand, maybe there's a little bit of a flooding of the market, so to speak, but that's, I guess that. Yeah,
I would look at it just though that a lot of people find his work useful for what they're doing. I mean, at least that part of it's a great thing. And that people have access to it, and not only access to the work itself, but access to all kinds of ways in, because as we all know, it's not easy. So having both ways in via his work, like you two were saying earlier, that the Proust book might be one means of doing that, but then also all kinds of commentators and people who have been inspired by him, and those are other ways in, I guess, that people have.
I did want to connect our discussion of Deleuze to your current work. And I just wanted to remind you, since I guess it has been 30 years, but it looks like the last two sentences of Gilles Deleuze on Apprenticeship in Philosophy is, and I'm just looking at the PDF of your book, by the way. The quote is, "In the existing social practices and the effective expressions of popular culture and the networks of labor and cooperation, we should seek to discern the material mechanisms of social aggregation that can constitute adequate, affirmative, joyful relationships and thus powerful subjective assemblages. Filling out the passage from multiplicity to multitude remains for us the central project for a democratic political practice." I was just kind of amazed revisiting this in light of your subsequent work, how that interest of elaborating this concept of multitude, and on the other hand, even, for example, this cultivating the Spinozistic notion of joy, which we find as early as the labor of Dionysus, your first kind of co-authored work with Negri, so you see this trajectory throughout your publishing career.
The depressing way of rephrasing what you just said is that like 30 years gone by, I haven't made any advances. Exact same thing. But I suppose, you could also say, certain kind of consistency of interest and such. I have to admit, it's a little surprising hearing you read it, because I don't remember those sentences.
Right.
But it's true. What I can imagine, though, is that, like you said, in that same period, I was translating Toni's book on Spinoza, in which the concept of multitude in Spinoza was really important for him. And I was trying, one of the things I was focused on then, just really for my own benefit, was trying to think what I understand the political implications of Deleuze's work to be. And so in some ways, in those sentences, I can see me trying to work through that. I mean, of course, one could go to answer that question to the Capitalism and Schizophrenia books, say, because Deleuze and Guattari, or together with Guattari, Deleuze is much better at expressing the political consequences that they see of the work. But at the time then I had read the Capitalism and Schizophrenia books, but in the book you were just mentioning, I was only focusing on some of the philosophical monographs earlier in his career. And so in which he wasn't making much explicit political deduction, let's say, or I don't know what consequences of his thought, and that was sort of what I was thinking. So anyway, those sentences are, were an attempt. At the end of a book, one always has to have a. Well, I say it's this, everyone does. I mean, okay, at the end of the book, I always have to have this moment that says, like, et voila. Like, what? So,
Right.
So what? Or something like that. And so I can recognize those sentences as an attempt to.
Got to wrap a bow around it, right? You got to,
Well, and sort of say what the consequences are.
Yeah.
It's what's important about this. And what was important about it for me, obviously, going to be different for other people.
But it is important that one of the earliest books on Deleuze to be published, as you said, in any language, but especially in English, focuses, even if you are focusing on Bergson, Spinoza, Nietzsche, which I think is one of his holy trinities, if you want to like narrow it down, if you have to, but I do think that it's nice for you to have articulated the ethical, political stakes in Deleuze's work, when a lot of times, as you said, we can get bogged down merely in the ontology and forget to connect the ontological to the ethical. Again, as I said, you concisely sum this up in the conclusion, but you do it throughout the book, is, and they even say in A Thousand Plateaus, ethics precedes politics, politics precedes being. I think that's how they phrase it. But, I think that too often Deleuze can be thought of as this apolitical figure who, I mean, you're right to say Guattari helped to bring out the expression of the political consequences of, theory or of theorizing capitalism. But, whenever I think about Deleuze as apolitical, which I think can sadly get reduced in a certain terms, I think of, for me, it always stood out, the Image of Thought chapter in Difference of Repetition, where there is a kind of politics inherent to critiquing the dogmatic image of thought. Again, with Guattari, it becomes it becomes front.
Foregrounded. Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly. You're right.
Coop, I know I always do this. I dominate a little bit.
No,
I wanted to let you perhaps get a word edgewise.
Just out of curiosity after reading, because I think one of the pieces that you recommended we take a look at for this, just so we can share this with the audience, it was a piece looking at Empire 20 years on.
Yeah.
Empire 20 years on. So, and looking at that, and then I just wanted to get a sense for your work a bit, just more broad sense as well, because I haven't had the chance to delve into it. It was neat kind of to see some resonances with the book on Deleuze popping up. And I think where I noticed that mostly was in this kind of discussion of multiplicity and the one and unity, and kind of moving back and forth between those sort of, maybe you might characterize it as a sort of social register. If I thought that was neat, and if you're willing to and would be open to that, we might dig into a little bit under the hood of the Empire 20 years later, and kind of draw from your prior work just to see like what's the sort of undergirding theory that kind of propelled you to write this. So I was perhaps either going to read this myself or have you read. This is just a little excerpt from Empire 20 Years On that I thought kind of maybe would open up the space for conversation. I'm happy to read it unless you would prefer to do so.
Yet to theorize multiplicity, or even to recognize existing multiplicities, is not enough, especially if by multiplicity one means simply fracturing and separation. To be politically effective, organization is required. And when dealing with multiplicities, that pressure is even more intense. To respond to our initial question, how can a multiplicity decide and act politically? Simply by saying that it needs to organize is not very helpful. The next step then requires a return to the concept of class, but class conceived differently now, in order to explore more fully what a multitude can become and how it can act politically. One obvious objection to the proposal of this second movement, from multitude to class, is that it unravels all the advantages achieved in the previous movement, from a unified political conception based on a single axis of domination, that determined by capital, to a multiplicity which also engages patriarchy, white supremacy, and other axes. Our intention, however, is to develop a conception of class that refers not only to the working class, but is itself a multiplicity, a political formation that makes good on the gains of the multitude. I should contextualize this a little bit, is that what Toni and I were trying to recount here is one theoretical move that was important for us, especially in the 90s, and was part of the project in Empire, which was to think the political subject, which had for many in the revolutionary and progressive West been the working class determined by capital. I mean, and in some ways to the exclusion in many political formations of, or subordination, let's say, of feminist struggles and anti-racist struggles, thinking of them somehow as somehow less than or different under the rubric of class. One of the things that was important to us in Empire in the 1990s was to make that political subject open to multiplicity in two respects. And this is what we meant by multitude at the time in the 1990s. So in one respect, let's say this is the more restricted multiplicity, is recognize that whereas at the time for many, the industrial working class really represented the class as a whole, that introducing multiplicity into working class here was recognizing all of the different forms of waged and unwaged labor that are, of course, defined by racial and gender hierarchies, but also different forms of work and even the unemployed. So recognizing class as a multiplicity was one, but then a much larger multiplicity in the recognizing the subject of revolution and as a feminist subject and as an anti-racist subject. And in addition to those struggling against capital, or that often intersecting with, of course, or overlapping with, or interwoven with. So any case, all that's still prelude, which is that bit was important for us. The movement from class to multitude was not an abandonment of the class or even abandonment of the working class, rather thinking of it as in a larger framework. I mean, in some ways I'm giving now, our terminology for a shared project, among a really wide range of people, it seems to me, from the 1990s onward. So that notion of multiplicity seems super important to us and still does. But now we get back to the paragraph that you just suggested, which is that to say multiplicity, or even to think multiplicity, is not sufficient politically, doesn't guarantee the effectiveness, and so the way we had thought of it, I would say, when we were writing Empire was, well, yes, of course, but you have to organize. Multitude isn't just a kind of disparate multiplicity. Multitude is an organized multiplicity, and that's what political organizations are required to do that. And so in some ways here we're feeling like that. I think that aspect of our notion of multitude and even of political multiplicity was very poorly understood, or often easily misunderstood without, and so this seemed to us a way of, or a need to, I mean, I do think it for us, it was just not that the changing idea or even changing social circumstances, but a more effective way of expressing it. Yes. So here we're saying that, whereas in the 1990s, it felt to us important conceptually and politically to move from class to multitude in order to affect that multiplicity. Now we need to recognize the movement, which we're calling here, from multiplicity to class, but of course not just like a pendulum swinging back to the first one, but rather the notion of class as a organizational project, and an organizational project that isn't only directed towards capital, because this is, at least we try to argue that and point to examples where people think class, as this was a 70s project within certain feminist authors of, sex class, or thinking about race in terms of class too. In any case, all we really mean is an organizational project. And then, of course, we're also charmed by the I don't know, inside Marx joke, where this CMC can now be CMC prime, rather than MCM prime, so class prime as but this designation of class prime for us, that, what do you call it? The point of arrival of this movement,
right?
Class prime has to be a notion of a multiplicity organized as effective political subject. And hence, class, in some ways, class functions here, some ways, the way the concept of party does. I mean, because in the same way, party is often assumed to mean centralized decision-making and centralized organizational structure, but really party means politically effective organization. And so if party means that, then I'm all for it. If party, on the other hand, means either a vanguard organization or even a centralized decision-making structure, but I think it's helpful to broaden, at least this is rhetorical or conceptual effort here, to broaden our conceptions of what class and party, and to make new use of the terms. That's the effort. That's way too long an explanation for that paragraph.
No, you got to the heart of one of the sections you wanted to focus on was this fifth section. And I think, your way of articulating intersectionality as inherent to this notion of class prime was really helpful for me to understand specifically, and I may need to look at the text, how you exactly articulate it, but specifically this notion that, as you said, sex class, race class, et cetera, aren't necessarily external qualifiers that are just added on, but in here and are articulated kind of internally. It's kind of like an inclusive disjunction, so to speak, rather than an exclusive disjunction. That's how at least I was thinking of it in terms of, kind of Deleuze and Guattari, speak. But the point being that those relations aren't sort of externally welded on. And so you just kind of agglutinate all these different identities and struggles, but that the struggles themselves they have to sort of merge together precisely because things like capitalism, patriarchy are co-constitutive. That way of articulating it, I think, because I was reading some of this to my wife, just as an aside, because she has a shirt, she's wearing a shirt today that says everyone should be feminist, or I think something like this. And so when I read your example that you gave, I think it's the second one from Iris Young, sort of exhorting male socialists to realize that, feminism and feminist struggles against patriarchy isn't necessarily something external to the struggle against capitalism, that there's no way that can be a secondary consideration just added on. It has to be a part of the sort of struggle, whether it be revolutionary struggle or et cetera. It has to be that way of articulating and thinking about whether it be multitude or this move from multitude to class prime really struck me as very concise and cogent. I appreciated that. And she did too. She was like, fuck yes, I love this guy. So, that's why I think that this paragraph kind of opens us onto this discussion of this way of sort of thinking of struggles as, what was it that Rosa Luxemburg said, the quote that you repeat? It's like, it has to be a chapter. We have to think of these quote unquote other struggles as a chapter in our own history, something like this, right?
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right. I just wanted to say something that's obvious that you're already saying, which is that, here what Toni and I are trying to express is something not at all original. It's something that's, I would call it, the centerpiece even of the current political theoretical agenda. And so different people are approaching it from different angles and sometimes with different terminology, but that's good. And I don't mean, when I say not original, I mean that in a good way, actually. I think it's part of a common project. And that's what, like you say, I hope it's recognizable, and then people say, well, yeah, of course, that's what I'm already doing. Like, awesome. That's exactly the way it should be.
Yeah, and it's good to be able to articulate. I mean, obviously, intersectionality is, that's not necessarily original to you, but your way of articulating how that should be thought of, rather than it being thought of merely as inclusion in this kind of passive sense. There's this active notion that's embodied in sort of, thinking of these struggles as, if not one and the same, then at least a part of the same sort of practice or mindset.
I would even say it, right. I think that's right. And I would even add that I think part of the political work is the process of articulating the struggles together, so that it doesn't mean that they become the same struggle. It's rather both the forms of solidarity, the recognition, like you said, of it being part of one's own struggle. Mm-hmm. But also I think that politically, it's part of what political organization is about, is creating these processes of articulation. Yeah, that don't reduce something to a unity, that don't subordinate one struggle to another, but instead create. I mean, you could say, okay, so since we're in friendly environment, you could say that it's a process of constructing assemblages. I mean, if you could think of assemblage in that way, which of course, assemblages are never a unified homogeneous whole, but they are relatively consistent planes of articulation. I'd say something like that. They could always be deconstructed. I was going to deconstituted. I was trying to remember there was some Spinoza letter about the blood, where he says that okay, I'm not exactly remembering it, but there's some term about the disarticulation, which worked better in that regard. But anyway, that's what I mean. They're always temporary. They're always constructions, these kinds of articulations or assemblages, but not for that reason any less powerful.
In the conclusion to your book on Deleuze, you talk about the difference between assemblages of power, right? A agencement de puissance versus these deployments of power, which are these, which is obviously the negative sort of macro term, the dispositif de pouvoir. Yeah. So this difference in what in Spinoza it's potentia and potestas, right? Something like this. This difference between sort of the imminent, relationality of assemblages and what they are capable of, what they can affect and be affected by, et cetera, versus this notion of power as you mentioned earlier with the party structure as centralized, hierarchized, et cetera, right? Tree structure versus rhizome, again, like since we're doing it. But Coop, I know that a minute ago you did have something to say. I'm sorry to, hopefully you kept your point. If not, we can.
Just briefly, in the context of, I guess, reading Anti-Oedipus, something that has come to my attention, or something that I think it's been a heavy focus for me, would be, and I think it dovetails into this conversation about how, these different forms of oppression intersect and so forth. And this is kind of skipping ahead a bit too because in the piece Empire 20 Years On, you're discussing sort of the common and extractive processes and how that sort of is beginning to seep into the digital realm and biometric data, et cetera. But I think one of the fundamental, social reproduction is one of the earliest things that sort of captured relative to the reproductive capacity of women, this theft and this sort of, but almost like a chatteling of the reproductive capacity of women sort of being this initial extractive, even enclosing process, one might even say, right?
It's back to the forefront with the leaked decision, so to speak, that's, I guess, impending whenever they decide to release it, of this overturning of Roe v. Wade. So that's like front and center back in, at least in American politics, but that's not by any means restricted to the shores of this nation.
I'm not sure if you're familiar. We have spoken to Thomas Nail, who's kind of in the new materialist realm, and we looked at his book, Marx in Motion. And this is one of the biggest arguments that he made in the book, was that this enclosure of the commons, this extractive process is literally, it is straight up theft. And that straight up theft is what allows, capital to really persist. And to me, I just connect that to initially one of the fundamental commons that's captured would be the reproductive capacity of women, and obviously we can see this process, it's an ongoing process, not something that ever really stops. Like I said, with regard to the digital commons, biometric data, and the way that social media tries to extract some type of value from just, I don't know, what would you call it? Just merely social relations? Well,
capturing our attention.
The
dopamine drip, whatever it is.
Using our own even capital, really almost like fracking. How fracking is really just trying to suck out the petroleum that's in those little cracks. This is, to me, a good metaphor for what capitalism is trying to do in this way. It's kind of like, you bring up Airbnb and Uber as well, and I think those even play into this, right? Because it's like, if my car is sitting idle out in my garage, that's wasted opportunity cost, or there's a certain waste of resources. Housing, all of that is the same, but then we begin to see how insidious this becomes, and I think as particularly in the form of Airbnb, the unintended consequences of Airbnb were really devastating to the housing market. But we'll see how all this plays out in the new higher interest rate environment.
So yeah, I suppose, Michael, respond to any of that, because Coop, that was great. You did bring together a lot of things. So sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to do a bibliographical note for listeners. I mean, that the part about the capture of women's reproductive powers as a kind of privatization of the common is certainly a centerpiece of Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, which many of the listeners probably already know, but if they don't, that's a great place to go for that. And that, I mean, Silvia Federici represents sort of one stream of this thinking about the common or the commons, depending on who's saying it, and the way that capital is defined by or characterized by a capture, rather than thinking about, or in addition, or in collaboration with thinking about capital as the extraction of surplus value, and hence as the exploitation of labor, thinking about capital in terms of the capture of the common. I think that a lot of, I would say, contemporary Marxism could be thought of within that, the play between those two notions of capitalists, of the functioning of capital, something like that. So anyway, all I did, that was just a footnote rather than adding anything to what you were saying.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really give you much of a question, but I thought that might just open up space for some of that discussion of the common. I know that obviously the discussion of Uber, Airbnb, like this sort of the rise of the rentier economy is a sort of newer development that we've been looking at, and I'm kind of curious to see, how that will develop, because it feels like Uber, like all these kind of gig economies those companies are going to start to fold because of the new interest rate environment. Like, what's going to happen to labor? There seems to be, sort of crisis building depending on how that shakes out over the next few years.
It is interesting, though, that, as you already pointed out, in empire, but as Marx also pointed out, capitalism and empire seem to thrive off of these crises,
true, right?
Rather than necessarily see them as an obstacle. Just piggybacking off of what Coop said, one of the things that I really appreciated from Empire, and that we see in Guattari's thought too from the 70s, one of the texts we talked about a few months back was called 9 Theses of the Left Opposition. And he's articulating this notion that socialist struggles, or the struggles of the working class, if they are merely hyper-focused on national borders, they're doomed to fail. And this is one of the things that keeps coming back, not just in the 20 Years On essay, but in Empire itself. Obviously there are, so to speak, dangers inherent in globalization, but you and Toni, or you and Negri, are sort of always hitting this point that it also gives us tools to fight back against. And so one of the things that I appreciated was this notion of the proletarian movement, the revolutionary class, whatever you want to call it. These struggles have to be thought of as supranational, as taking place around the globe. And if they remain insular, even if that seems like prioritizing the local, there's sort of an inherent fault to not having. So I guess I'm re-articulating it as intersectionality has to also be thought of as kind of a global phenomenon, right?
Right. I think, at least my recollection of Guattari language about these things is the linking transversal struggles, which I'm thinking of as another way of thinking a certain kind of intersectional notion of struggles. It's the transversality with the international framework, which was always part of Guattari's vision or mandate. I think also recognizing even when struggles are very local, and maybe even, some might say that they always are, the struggles themselves are always local, recognizing and even acting on their global context, their solidarity with, or even potential actual links with struggles elsewhere. Yeah, it seems super useful. And also, when you just think about things going on, it's easy to recognize that in the most interesting and inspiring contemporary movements. Like one of the things I'm most excited about in the last many years is the feminist movement originating in Argentina, Ni Una Menos, and really originating against femicide and sexual violence, but really incorporating all kinds of labor struggles and ecological struggles and indigenous struggles, etc. But that it's not only linked in other Latin American countries, but also in Italy and Spain and Poland, and the kind of international articulations that go on. So I mean, Ni Una Menos in that sense is a great example of those two axes, that you were talking about. The one, which is that they're very insistent that it not be closed as a feminist struggle that's isolated from other struggles,
Right.
that it's also, like I said, labor struggle and indigenous struggle, etc. But then, so it's transversal in that sense, say within Argentina, but then immediately linked to reproductive struggles in Poland and in Spain and etc. So that's what's going on. So in some ways, I think this is also true about all the work I've done with Toni. When I say this, the thought I'm just having, I know that Toni hates it when I say it this way, but it's that I feel like, once again, in this regard, that there's nothing really original about our work. Like what we're really doing is we're thinking with the movements that are already happening. And so it's not like, if someone were to say, well, you're talking about multiplicity, you're just talking about intersectionality, and a million people have done that. And that's, developed through Black feminist thought in the US. But all these things, absolutely true. We're completely unoriginal in that, or that these movements are doing that. And you're just, in a way, expressing the aspirations and, in some ways, the accomplishments of these movements. Absolutely. Like, that's what I feel like I should start some movement to take pride in unoriginality. The movements are doing this, describing it this way in terms of transversality or articulation, which I like better in some ways, but is really just a way of trying to think with the accomplishments and problems facing the movements themselves. And I think that's what Toni and I have done for quite a long time. I mean, that's and that he was already doing before I was, maybe before I was born. I was saying before I was politically conscious, at least. But
in a sense, thinking in terms of whether it be Marx and the general intellect, or whether it be Spinoza in terms of the emendation of the intellect as sort of contributing to whether it be, I'm not sure the translation, whether it be commonwealth or the common good, something like this. I mean, so unoriginality doesn't necessarily have to be a fault. There is a certain sense in which articulating and elaborating adequate ideas boost everyone's power, right? So I guess one of the things that I think is interesting, perhaps, the way that the 20-year retrospective essay ends, and maybe perhaps is, again, not to fault your unoriginality, so to speak, as you called it, is this notion that, and you start the essay this way, but this notion that it seems like empire is fading away, but in fact, it's like, as you say at the end, it's taken this invisibility potion, and we have to sort of conjure up means of countering that sort of cloak of invisibility that it's been able to put on, and be able to find these new and more articulated, I'm going to use your word, theories of struggle against empire. So I think that's what was interesting to me too, is this notion that it's just better able to hide itself. And part of the way that it's better able to hide itself is, these movements that we've seen in the past decade, both here in America and Eastern Europe, et cetera, these rise of reactionary, you mentioned Brexit, of course, too. You can add that in there. These reactionary movements that seem to be sort of, on the face of it, they're, so to speak, anti-globalist. But you point out it's perhaps not so much anti-globalist as wanting to sort of rearrange themselves in an upper echelon of the hierarchies in the global order. I thought that was a really interesting way of sort of putting it, to show that these anti-globalist movements are perhaps more bemoaning or showing this nostalgia for a lost hierarchical position in the global order.
Right. And a little bit, when you express it like that, it's a little bit like the injured masculinity or whiteness as resentment of its loss of position of privilege, reading that in a kind of global scale, that maybe a certain fiction of Britain, let's say, that could function as that kind of expression of resentment and loss. Right. That's interesting. I mean, one of the things that I had been struck by, thinking 20 years back to the times when Empire came out, really not when we were writing it, because that was in the midst of those movements around globalization, or that made globalization explicit, thinking about Seattle WTO and Genoa G8 meetings and the various things around them. One of the things that I think been really impressed by then was the pedagogical nature of those movements, the ways that they were exploring the way the global power structure works.
Yeah.
So that by revealing, I remember that what I was thinking at the time was, that if the movements thought that the US was really in control of global order and global things, they should be every weekend at the Pentagon or at the White House or at whatever, the thing. But instead they were, experimenting with different and new power centers, let's say, like the WTO or the G8 or free trade in the Americas, or, there were every series. So what was derided at the time, and, with plenty of truth to it, is the kind of summit hopping, because, activists would go to each of these summits. I think it had a real intellectual process of clarification. And that's something that seems to me we could use again, that kind of the contemporary movements, at least I don't see it in the same way, of experimenting with an understanding of the global system of power, the capitalist system, the systems of white supremacy, the patriarchal systems, which aren't unrelated to each other. And so working out those connections seems to me, it's one of the ways in which I recognize the superiority of those movements with regard to our present movements. There are other ways in which the present movements are clearly superior to those. It's just one of the advantages they had was, I think, that intellectual endeavor.
Off the top of my head, before we started, I was talking to Cooper about one of the merits of your collaboration with Toni Negri. One of the things that Deleuze and Guattari lament, say, after Anti-Oedipus was published, even though it had, I believe it, not only in France, but in Italy, it had some success in at least influencing. Yeah. One of the things they regret, though, is the fact that they perhaps could have written in a way that would have been more legible, let's just say. It is dense and theoretically difficult in certain ways, even though that was for them their way of getting the machines, the analytic machine and the revolutionary machine, et cetera, to sort of coalesce. But one of the things I was praising about your work with Antonio is the fact that, for me at least, it feels like, even though it has theoretical implications and theoretical concepts, et cetera, it seems like it's written for someone who doesn't have a background, say, in the history of philosophy, or it's written in a way that's very accessible, which, again, perhaps is a nicer way of saying unoriginal or something. But I feel like there's a way in which, compared to a text like Anti-Oedipus, or even like quote unquote original texts like A Thousand Plateaus, there's a certain sense in which you can dive into your collaborations with Antonio without the need for, hunting down bibliographical citations or doing, a deep dive into Spinoza, et cetera. You're able to, I guess that's part of the problem, perhaps, with the Deleuzean philosophy's concept creation is if that's first and foremost, there is a sense in which there is a lot of legwork and mental gymnastics to be done to be able to start to have a fluency in the kind of monster slang that they elaborate. So in a certain sense, I think that there is a merit for being able stylistically to reach a much wider audience than, what I would think of lovingly myself as like a theory nerd or, a Francophile, whatever.
No, it's kind of you to say that. I doubt it's as true as you make it sound about the accessibility part. But I think that these collaborations, I think this is true of Deleuze and Guattari, even though, I didn't know them, together already. But I think the way these collaborations often work is really, and this is a great thing about them, is they're focused on each other. It's partly writing for each other rather than writing for, and so there is a kind of tendency towards, like the other person understands it. And so it's sort of enough. The two of us understand it and we understand each other. I was just wondering how much Deleuze and Guattari is sort of that way, that they, thinking about each other more than about like a general readership. Like trying to talk to each other and write for each other. And I've often thought about it that way with me and Toni. Is the things that we write together, it's not like I write in my voice and he writes in his voice. It's sort of like, it's more like I sort of write in what I'm, imagining him to be saying. And he's sort of writing in what he's imagining me to be saying. And it turns out it's something different than either one of us, but it's all mixed up in a, not exactly an internal dialogue, but there is something about that. And I can definitely see that sort of thing with Deleuze and Guattari, where they get excited about each other and what each other's saying, and and working with it. Just one little anecdote to go back with something you were saying about the accessibility thing, which is, and this is not even my anecdote. I think it's Bifo, Franco Berardi, who told me this, which was that as a kind of, I don't know if it's exactly true either, but he said that in 1968 in Italy, the kids who were trying to be revolutionaries had Lenin's State and Revolution in their pocket. And in 1977 in Bologna, they had anti-oedipus in their pocket. As that was the equivalent of what would have been Lenin from a decade earlier. To demonstrate that they're, I suppose even with what we're saying right now, maybe they weren't even understanding what it was, but they knew that was what it, I don't know, the direction or what it meant to be trying to be revolutionary today. I don't know if we went in a similar way, I don't know can you guys imagine what would be the book that people would?
If you had written a similar style or type of,
if there's a revolutionary, let's say if the revolutionary is a genre per se, like what would be the what would would represent our sort of capital or what have you? I don't know that there is necessarily
revolution no, I have some candidates in mind, but I don't think there isn't a single.
I think what is it? Fisher's capitalist realism is kind of, that's kind of a weak choice,
but
I think
depressing one.
yeah, I suppose.
It's a great book, and he's great and everything, but it's not like the
right.
When I was in grad school about a decade ago, Empire was still a pretty well discussed book, and when you saw it included in all kinds of classes from post-colonial to digital theories, it definitely was like Foucault and Derrida and these others. And I was in the comparative literature program, but your work with Negri was definitely one that grad students were assumed to have been at least familiar with, if not well read in. I'll try to keep from giving more praise. I know that's but I guess I like that you reflected on whether it be, the assemblage that you form with Antonio, because, Deleuze and Guattari have reflected on this a lot. And Cooper and I have had the chance to, not to self-aggrandize, but kind of think about the fact that, we do think about this where the podcast is, if he and I are reading things that interest us and we are sort of able to work through and elaborate our understanding and be able to bounce off each other in ways that we feel are productive and stimulating, then we assume that to a certain extent that'll translate for a listener who might be sucked in and influenced and maybe motivated, etc., or at the very least entertained, but hopefully more than that. And I think that's part of what you were saying, where, just one last thing about the unoriginality thing, where you are boosting these, not just other voices, because you're very generous with your citations and elaborations of where certain concepts come from. But, there's a phrase that I've thrown around because it stuck in my head from a professor, this notion of joining a chorus of scholarly voices. There's a way in which even that can have a boosting effect and an effect of stimulating thought and perhaps changing hearts and minds, if you want to put it that way. But there is something that I think is why one writes, why one, participates in conferences and academia, et cetera, right? Why even do a theory podcast is to sort of be able to create this velocity of ideas and thinking that can change hands and perhaps be reused or repurposed or even etc.
I have a Spinoza version of saying the same thing about the podcast and about the two of you, which is that, first of all, you need Spinoza definitions for these things. So first of all, joy for Spinoza really is the increase of our power to think and act. So we experience joy and love, which is dependent on joy. Love is joy with the recognition of an external cause. So you increase your power to think and act, and you recognize that there is an external cause of that. So intellectual love, in some sense, is that here's the way I understand it in a really basic way, which is that, most of the times, I would say even with most people, that you meet and you talk to, I actually feel more stupid. I thought I understood something. We start talking, it falls apart. I can't understand it. But there's some people with whom, when we start talking together, it really does increase my power to think. And so, first of all, Spinoza would say, hold on to those people. That fits within this category of love for him, because it's the increase of your power to think with the recognition of an external cause. And so in some ways, what the process of adequation, like now I'm even thinking about that Deleuze book that I had written about, since you mentioned it earlier, about this, which is that it might be, random that you encounter somebody like that. But what the process of adequation that Deleuze was so interested in Spinoza is that you envelop the cause, like you construct a relationship so that it's not random. That's what I meant by like, hold on to that person. It's sort of, and so then the increase of your power to think is just part of your, the relationship together. Anyway, it'd be nice to think of a podcast that way too. It's just a way that creating joyful encounters, meaning increasing your power to think.
You could obviously try to entice Toni to start one with you. I know it's never too late, right? Never too late to start one, but
just have all kinds of language problems.
Exactly. It might be for an Italian audience, I suppose. Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure how good his English is, but
not. No.
I guess that's an interesting question then. With your collaboration, is it mostly done in Italian and then you're responsible for the English?
The traditional way we've done it, I guess it's always this way, which is that he writes in Italian, I write in English, and then eventually I'm responsible at the end for getting everything in English.
So you've been a translator for much more than just the Savage Anomaly, I guess, then.
I guess so. Although, the translation process was a lot of it is when, the way it worked actually in Empire, it was more, I don't know, home artisanal at the time. He was writing on his typewriter and I was using a computer, but right. we would exchange printed copies. And so he would, in order to revise what I wrote, he would cut with scissors and then type in other paragraphs and then paste them to a piece of paper and stuff like that.
That's awesome.
But
wow.
I would take advantage of the translation to revise things. In some ways, I've felt I have a privilege because I have more control over it if I'm doing that part. I miss that. It's much more convenient, obviously, doing these things on the computers now and stuff. Just thinking of it now, talking to you, that those pasted together sheets where there's a paragraph in English, a paragraph in Italian, and things glued together is stuff.
Yeah,
it's a nice.
That'd be a nice little artifact to have. Like, I feel like there's that book that Jodorowsky made of like the Dune he was going to do, and it was like this giant. He had like.
And so we have to return to Dune.
Yes, we do.
He storyboarded the whole movie, so it's like this giant fat book, and it's just like all these sheets of like drawings and so forth.
No, that's
kind of what that reminded me of.
And you're right. I mean that the original manuscript with the copy and pasting, it belongs.
Yeah, that would be awesome. That's like a cool art piece. You know what I mean? If you're gonna do a Deleuze and Guattari art piece, that's almost like a interesting one.
Just really quickly, just on this, Coop, you've seen the chair, right?
Yes, the one that you made with the cutting out of Kant or.
I was in an experimental text class, and we were basically supposed to do an experimental text, which included the style. Which had an essay kind of describing the art project, but the art project, I took a computer chair and I cut up 25 of my sort of quote unquote favorite books, which Nietzschean philosophy, I think The Sublime Logic of Ideology. I think one of the books was The Critique of Pure Reason. These were all books that I had scribbled on, marginalia, annotated, and I sort of decoupaged the computer chair with all of these little pasted on, all of these these little fragments, and I still have that in the garage. But that was definitely the most interesting thing I've done with, and I wrote about it in terms of non-philosophy and stuff. Anyway, one of the things that's interesting, just to, since it's on top of my head, Deleuze was the one who also kind of had the quote unquote power, right? Guattari was the one who turned out a lot of the writing. Deleuze was more of the editing. But the interesting intermediary, though, was that Guattari was writing longhand, and it was Fanny, Deleuze's wife, who supposedly typed up those manuscripts for them. And so it's interesting just thinking about one of the things we talked about earlier with this sort of unpaid labor, right, that goes in that, if you cut out Fanny from the Deleuze and Guattari crowd assemblage, you kind of lose a very key component. And I think that is just interesting to always have in mind when thinking about, I guess, taken for granted or taken as obvious, these components that go into making those kind of collaborations possible. With Cooper and I, it's microphones and internet, Wi-Fi, the digital interface. But, for you and Toni, it was, at least for Empire, it had to do with this manual. I guess there's something of an aura to it, in the Walter Benjamin sense, right? That artifact. I definitely one of the things I also wanted to say, but I think we already said it, I wanted to make sure we covered this, was one of the themes that we see not only in the 20 years essay, but in Empire itself, is how a lot of the means of not only capitalism, but sort of empire, the global phenomenon, is this response to workers' demands and workers' struggles and things like this. I thought that was, maybe that's something, again, that you see elsewhere, but the thread was not lost on me. And I think it made a big impact, seeing this notion that then too, we have to use the tools we have to also kind of adapt to that type of adaptation and use those tools against the edifice itself.
Maybe one could start with Marx Engels' idea, even in the manifesto, that, and this is something that, certainly is completely through and through of my and Toni's thinking, which is that capital always provides the weapons that can be used against it, that it necessarily in its own development, for its own interests, has to provide the weapons, which doesn't mean that, capital creates its own downfall. It provides the weapons. Those weapons then have to be adapted and used, etc. Yeah, wielded, exactly. I mean, I remember this was even maybe while we were writing Empire, we were thinking of three different sources of this idea that you're talking about. Maybe the most explicit one is the claim in Mario Tronti's book, Workers and Capital, which is now actually finally in English. And the claim there was really around the workers' struggle, that his claim was that the struggle of the workers precedes and prefigures the developments of capital. And part of the consequence of that, one could say something like that, and it could sound super depressing. Like, no matter what we do, capital profits from it. It's rather, I think the importance is to emphasize the power that, like, the source of innovation and the power we have. Maybe another of the sources, like, well, the two others that we were thinking of at the time were the subaltern studies group, in some ways recognizing that, and even their way of thinking history from below. I mean, that it's not that all of the innovations of the Raj were constructed by the British colonial powers, but in fact, you have to see that the moment of innovation of history, like the construction of history, really happened from the colonized. I mean, that's just as a way of seeing it, in that we've only read previously. This was, just a basic point of theirs and others at the time. We've only read the history of the colonizers. So anyway, the third one that translates back to our vocabulary of our discussion today was, at least it started for me just as a footnote in Deleuze's Foucault book, where he says something like, everybody reads the notion of resistance in Foucault and assumes that that it comes after power. And he says, no, in fact, resistance is prior to power. He doesn't mean it historically, which, Tronti is in some ways made doing this historically, but rather I think Deleuze means it ontologically, which is to say that resistance is the moment of innovation, and creation power really just falls back. The way Deleuze and Guattari are always saying that power falls back, it really just recuperates. Anyway, we were thinking all three of these things as the same, resonating with each other, and more or less ways of describing. Yeah, this is where I was starting with what you said, ways of describing the fact that not only capital, but other forms of domination also have within them and give us the means to topple them. Like, it's not only that capital creates its own gravediggers, it also creates the weapons to assassinate, and then gravedigger too, I suppose. Yeah. But I like the first part, and so anyway, I think that is a sort of general theoretical principle that demonstrates, that the importance, I think, for it is that demonstrates the history of that power. So that when Toni and I say, for instance, if you want to look at globalization in the 20th century, really you need to look at internationalism, proletarian internationalism, anti-racist. Look at Bandung, look at all the other circuits of, the proletariat was internationalist before capital was, that sort of
Right.
idea. And so were the anti-racist struggles. And so this is, it's not like these are just victims of a genius that has been moving history to dominate them. It's really that history has been moving through struggles, and that so far the structures of power have been able to recuperate and find ways to restructure but I think part of the importance of that method of reading for us is one that to emphasize the power that exists, not being victims, but being defeated. I mean, that's true,
Right.
but defeated's a lot different than being passive victim.
Vanquished. Yeah.
Yeah. Communist history is full of defeats.
Yeah.
maybe only defeats. I mean, I want to win, of course, but recognizing those defeats is not
doesn't have to be depressing.
It's really the sort of step on from which to move forward. Yeah.
I think Badu says something about the history of communism, the events that took place in the 20th century, et cetera. They don't define the essence of communism. So I think that's how I try to think of it, that the essence of communism isn't necessarily compromised by the failures of its history, if you want to call it that. So, and I like this notion because I know it shows up in the first opening chapters of Empire about this point that resistance is prior, because if it weren't, there would be a sense in which we're either in a Hegelian type of reactionary negation of the negation, et cetera, right? It has to be sort of an affirmation of an affirmation, to put it in the Dionysian and Ariadne terms.
In that discussion of the sort of, I guess, the resistance coming first, I was just thinking about, something from our lifetimes that really exemplifies this fairly well would be, I'm thinking back to like Napster, whenever that was kind of blowing up, and that really, that exploded the music industry. It took a while, right? So eventually, it's kind of a free for all for a while, but then it is recuperated, and now we have this kind of rentier subscription model, and they really, now the whatever streaming companies, it's extended to all digital entertainment at this point, but you can kind of see how it's just a more aggressive extraction and elimination and flattening out of things.
What one should do, or at least what one should look for, I don't know, I can't find it right here myself, is that if there are ways of struggle against the
recuperation,
becoming property of music and stuff like that, if there are increased weapons, let's say, here than there were, because you're right that I remember the moment thinking, not just with Napster, but even with just the idea that, everyone I knew was violating the law just by making cassettes of music and sharing it with each other.
Right.
This was property. And it's true. And I was sort of thinking at the time then, well, this is great. Like all things are just, property is just going to be dissolved by these mechanisms that we have of, sharing and stuff like that. And clearly, as you're saying, 20 years later, 30 years later, no, they've developed these other mechanisms. But yeah, just like I said, that would be my instinct in thinking about it, would be to try to discover the ways that there are new weapons that are created within this. It's just a method of inquiry. It's not a guarantee that's it's going to work out, but that's sort of my way of going on this.
Seeking out those lines of flight. Just to anecdote for you, actually, Taylor and I met on Twitter, believe it or not. So there are those opportunities for there to be something, to weaponize things, to resist, and so forth. You just have to look for them.
Yeah, and you gotta, as you said, Michael, you gotta hold on to those people that boost your power and that you recognize envelop that cause. I will say that was you're weaponizing, to use the term of Spinoza's definition of love and power. Were both, that was beautiful. It was amazing. But I want to give you the last line. What is your current research projects? What are you working on? Anything just to leave us with, sort of what is in store in the future, whether or not you're still collaborating with Antonio Negri, just anything you want to give us as a parting gift.
Toni and I are working on a project. It's, of course, the way I've thought of it for these decades is it's a condition of the friendship that there be a book. You know, like we
Yeah.
have an excuse for talking to each other, and me flying to wherever he is and stuff like that. Although it's not that I have any secrets or something, just trying to explain what we're working on before it's done never makes any sense. And never. I did finish a book that'll come out next year. That's a really different kind of book about the 1970s, about the revolutionary movements of the 1970s in different parts of the world, which called the subversive 70s. And trying to recognize how the political problems posed by movements in the 70s in the Americas and Europe and Africa, I mean, try to do as many places as I could, how they posed the political problems that we still face today. And in some ways, the movements of the 70s, argument goes, are in fact more advanced. In some ways, we can recognize the seeds of the present, you know, like embryonic ways in which the contemporary struggles are formed, but more interesting sometimes is the way that they are in fact ahead of us. But anyway, it was fun. It was really enjoyable.
Anything on France, like post 68? Because again, just that's part of where a lot of the, you know, there's interconnections between the struggles in Italy and France, et cetera.
Right.
And also Coop mentioned that May 68, but, you know, reverse it in 86. That's when you and Antonio formed your friendship. There's an interesting symmetry there.
Bifo would be cool to talk to about that era, because if I'm not mistaken, I at least started his book on Guattari, and he talks about how he was in jail and someone brought him anti-oedipus to read in like 70 or 72 or something like that. Somewhere around there.
There's a lot about Italy and a certain amount about France and and everything else I could learn about.
I just want to thank you again for coming on to visit us and sort of, you know, revisiting Empire, but also discussing, you know, these theoretical issues that have practical implications, and just sharing your anecdotes and your thoughts. It's been a joy. I will say it's been a real pleasure. And
loved it.
We're going to let you go. We're going to hang on for just a minute to talk about what we're doing next week, but thanks again for your time. Yes. And
it's a pleasure. Please cut out all the boring parts.
We'll let you know when the episode drops. As Cooper said, it'll probably be early January. And
more than likely.
Great.
You know, if you had fun, maybe next year when your book drops, we'd love to have you back at some point.
Sure, that'd be great.
Excellent. Well, you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and thanks again so much for giving us your time.
Pleasure.
Thanks to Michael Hardt for joining us on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.